Father Marius Zerafa, what a great honor to have an art historian, a man in white, a Dominican, an expert in some of my favorite art here with us in the set. Thank you and welcome to Toronto.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about you and the wonderful work you're doing, what brings you here to Toronto all the way from Slima in Malta?
Well, I've been called and I came, and I'm being spoiled. I'm enjoying it, and it's my second visit to Canada. 20 years ago I was lecturing in Quebec City, but I've never been to Toronto, and I think it's a lovely, lovely place, and I've met some lovely people.
Might be good to talk about the sponsoring group or organization, your congregation, your community, the Dominican Fathers, the Order of Preachers, here in Canada and here in Toronto especially, have established a program, almost an institute, if you will, on preaching, on art history, and they're really nourishing the entire church in Canada. And you are one of the reasons that this institute is existing.
I think there's a great need for it.
It really is the new evangelization at work. And I want to let our viewers know that the Dominicans are not many in English Canada, but it's quality and they go deep, and certainly their presence at the Faculty of Theology, for example, here at the University of St. Michael's is very much appreciated. So I thank them. I thank especially Father Darren Diaz, a young Dominican professor who's one of our stars, by the way. He's been on this program and he's well known to our viewers. Father Marius, you came all the way from Slima in Malta, and though you're based in that tiny island in the Mediterranean, you have an international outreach. You lecture at Roman universities. You frequent Moscow, other museums. You're here in Toronto now. You're involved in great art intrigues in Malta with the Caravaggio paintings. You're a member of the Order of Preachers. How did all this come about for you?
Well, the Dominicans are known for being sort of, their interest in various things. Art, for instance. I mean, we've produced Fra Angelico, who's the greatest, probably the greatest religious artist in the history of art. We've produced great architects. And it's a pity because I think we can do more. I lived in Florence at San Marco, and my ambition was always to set up an institute for sacred art, real sacred art.
As a member of the Dominicans and a congregation, as you so rightly pointed out, that produced Beato Fra Angelico and other artists, tell me a little bit about the link between preaching and beauty in art. I mean, some would like to think that preaching is done from a pulpit and it's words and texts, but it seems to me you have another approach to that.
Well, actually, when I give the course in Rome, I give to the students, I give them a quotation by Cardinal Ratzinger, the present Pope, before he became a Pope. And he says something quite interesting. He says the two great arguments for the Church, the apologia for the Church. He mentions two. One is the lives of the saints, and two, the art that has grown in the womb of the Church.
One of my favorite quotes of Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict.
I think these are the two great arguments for the validity, for the truth of Christianity.
And it's certainly been a theme that Pope Benedict has stressed from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
There's, the whole expression, there's nothing more beautiful than to know Christ.
Yes.
But this is not just a chasing after aesthetics that are superficial, but it's that profound beauty that entices and invites. I think of, for example, the way that Father Giussani, the head of the founder of Communion and Liberation, stressed the importance of art and beauty, and certainly the Dominican artists.
Certainly.
Do you have a favorite artist?
A lot of them. I mean, it's like which is your favorite child, no? Fra Angelico is obviously my choice, because I specialize in Fra Angelico. I lived at San Marco for years, and I've copied his works. But then in Malta, obviously, I had to deal with the Baroque, which is not my favorite. I had to deal with Caravaggio because...
He's not one of your favorites, though.
Yes and no. No, but I'd rather go for the Quattrocento. It's purer air. It's, I mean, when we get to the Baroque, we get a bit heavy and a bit sort of... The early Gothic, the early Renaissance is far more spiritual, far more...
Now, let's just go to the 16th century for a bit. I have a special interest in Caravaggio, the chiaroscuro, the magnificent paintings which have been such important catechetical pieces. But what's so intriguing about Michelangelo Merisi Caravaggio is what a life he lived.
Absolutely.
I mean, here we have a murderer, a marauder, a drunkard, a man with great difficulties, but capable of producing such extraordinary things. Is there an importance, is there a link, a necessity that the artist, and we know so many of these artists who had rather strange lives, do they have to have it all together? How is it?
Well,
How is it that
first
they
of
can
all,
do what they do?
there's a problem with the life of Caravaggio, because the life that we base our knowledge on was written by Baglione, who hated his guts. Okay, so you've got to take it with a pinch of salt.
Right.
But then another thing, I agree with you, because quite often in my lectures I say that in spite of his bad life, or perhaps because of his bad life, he could be so profoundly religious. I mean, he doesn't produce the sweetie stuff of normal people.
I think of the beheading of John the Baptist that I had the
Absolutely.
privilege of seeing last summer in Malta.
Yeah.
It is not the most, the softest and the
No,
most
no.
inviting painting.
And that's interesting, because at that time, when he was in Malta, he was under sentence of death, because he had fled from Rome after killing Ranuccio Tomassoni, and anybody could kill him and get a reward. So when he painted John the Baptist, and it's interesting that in that painting, instead of normally St. John the Baptist wore a camel skin, there he's wearing the sacrificial fleece, right, a sheepskin of sacrifice.
That's right.
And I think, why did he sign? That's the only painting that is signed with the blood of St. John, okay? And he signs Frate Michelangelo. And probably he did that because at that moment he was identified, apart from the fact that he had become a knight and he was proud of having achieved his ambition. But I think he was identifying himself with St. John. Okay, St. John was the patron of the order, and at that time I think he saw himself in similar circumstances because he himself was under sentence of death.
How could these paintings, for example, of Caravaggio, help us today with catechesis, with evangelization, with moving people's minds and inviting them to Christ?
Well, some of the paintings are absolutely impressive. I mean, one thing that you have to say about Caravaggio is that he has got what I call immediacy. I take my students to the church in Rome, San Luigi dei Francesi, and you see people walking past the other paintings. They don't pay attention. When they come to Caravaggio, they're stuck there because there's this dramatic contrast. You know, the luce di cantina, the contrast of strong light and strong shadows, and so on. So he arrests you, okay? And the message, he doesn't put in a lot of flying angels and clouds and blah blah blah. No, his message is immediate. And then one thing which few people understand is that he tries to place the person inside the picture. For instance, if you see our Saint Jerome, the crucifix on the table should fall off by force of gravity. In the Supper at Emmaus, he's got two versions. The one in London in the National Gallery, he's got one of the pilgrims with his hands spread out. The other one is jumping out of his chair, okay? And again, the fruit on the table is practically falling off. And then people criticize the fact that one of the hands in the distance should be smaller, whereas it isn't. And I think it isn't a mistake. I think it's because Caravaggio tries to bring in the spectator to be a part of the action, okay? To involve. That's why he puts his self-portrait in so many of the paintings, in Christ taken in the garden, in the martyrdom of St. Matthew. He puts himself present there to, in the beheading of St. John's, there's that old lady. It's like a chorus in a Greek play, and she's interpreting what's happening on the stage. That painting was done more or less the year that Shakespeare wrote King Lear. It's a drama, okay? And you have this old lady there interpreting, trying to make the public realize the drama that's happening on the stage. And I think there he was identifying himself with St. John, because he was always very, very, he was aware that he was under sentence of death all the time.
I couldn't agree with you more, especially in the Church of Saint Louis de France, Luigi de Francesi, that they walk past all of those side altars, and when they come to the end and the left, to put the coin in, and it's sometimes I stood there just to listen to people's reactions, trying to wonder, these are not art historians. A lot of them may not be catechized or evangelized, but there's a drama.
And then there's a drama of the hand of Christ, which reproduces the head of God in the Sistine Chapel, no? It's the new creation. There's the light that falls on St. Matthew, and it doesn't come to the window because the window is closed. So the light comes from on top of Christ, right? It's obviously the light of grace, okay? And then he added the figure of St. Peter. He painted the figure of Christ and then afterwards added St. Peter because he wanted to give a theological point that the grace comes through St. Peter to the church. Right? Then there's for the French it must have had a special meaning because that's the national church. And when those pictures were ordered, Henry IV had just come back into the church. So for the French it wasn't just the conversion of St. Matthew, it was the conversion of the French king and the French nation. Okay? And then another idea which I think is valid, those two young men in a contemporary dress, to signify that grace is not something that happened 2,000 years ago, but it's something that can happen all the time. Okay, so that's a very profound painting. I mean, that's one of my favorites. I mean, the incredulity of St. Thomas in Potsdam,
magnificent,
where Christ sort of brings in the hand and the attention is all focused on the side wound of Christ. That's great, all right? The Madonna dei Pellegrini in Sant'Agostino. I mean, it's a portrait of his girlfriend, Lena, but it's such a great painting. And there's these two pilgrims in bare feet. I mean, they weren't accepted because they were against the decoro that the Council of Trent was insisting on. For Caravaggio, bare feet meant, as for Borromeo, poverty and penance. Okay, and the way that they sort of there's got this diagonal composition. The way these two pilgrims go up to the Madonna, and the Madonna turns around. There's this serpentina movement. That's a great work of art.
Father, do you think we're using art enough in our day and age to teach and to preach, to catechize and evangelize?
No, because it's difficult to judge modern art. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff being produced, but modern art covers a multitude of sins. I think a lot of it will not last for the way that Caravaggio.
Why won't it last?
Well, because art is the expression of a concept. If the concept is not valid, your art is just okay. I mean, and the problem with modern art is that the art of the past, the artist was tied to something very valid, okay, Christianity. So he had a good message to give. A number of modern artists are just tied to their own personality, and there's very little there. So there's very little that they can give. No, I think that's
it's a very, very wise point.
I think that's Caravaggio is tied to this great tradition of Jesuit exercises of St. Ignatius, St. Philip Neri, Carlo Borromeo, you know. Michelangelo had all this tradition behind him. No? And nowadays, a modern artist may be great, may be capable, but...
Let's talk about another famous artist, Leonardo da Vinci.
Right.
And we have the famous Last Supper in the church in Milan, which I've seen many times.
I lived there for 3 months.
What an extraordinary place. But, you know, the more you study about Leonardo da Vinci, he was not exactly having a profound religious experience. No. And he was far from the church.
Absolutely.
Poorly paid, rather angry. Absolutely. And yet, how is it that he's capable of producing? Is the Last Supper the Last Supper?
It isn't. It isn't. In fact, I said something. Something was reported in the paper. I'm sure it's going to create some difficulty. He wasn't terribly religious, although we know that towards the end he asked for a priest. He was a very special person. He was not just an artist, he was a scientist, or a great scientist.
Sure,
and
if you
he
look
was
at some of the drawings.
Always asking questions. And most of his works he never finished, because for him it was the concept that was important. I think in one of his notebooks he wrote, il concetto è divino, l'esecuzione è servile. I'm not interested in carrying it out, so long as I have the concept
is divine.
Okay?
The execution is rather fleeting at times.
Okay,
Yeah.
so as regards the Last Supper, I mean, the whole idea is that it's the Last Supper. It's not the Last Supper. The two great things about that painting, which is in a Dominican refectory, so
That's
the
right.
idea was, while the fathers were having their meals, they would see a hole in the wall, and there they would see Christ and the apostles. Okay, it was meant to edify the Dominicans. Okay, so two great things about the Last Supper. It's beautifully constructed.
Yeah.
If you prolong the lines of the beams, the lines of the tapestries on the wall, the lines on the tiles on the floor, they all converge on a triangle,
That's right.
which is the figure of Christ.
Right.
Okay, so it's a perfect mathematical. Christ is a pyramid. The three apostles form a pyramid, and two rectangles. Okay, it's a pity that a stupid prior, we've had a lot of them, cut the feet of Christ because he thought it would be easy to go into the kitchen, straight into the kitchen. Okay, what he was interested in mainly, it was a period when he was studying psychological theories and so on, is that the reaction of 12 people when Christ says, one of you will betray me. So there's somebody looking up in surprise. The human reaction to this statement by Christ, one of you will deny me. Okay? And I mean, recently a lot of talk about Dan Brown with the Leonard and so on,
Yes.
which was very interesting, very, very clever, but absolutely with no basis at all, because the question of Saint Mary Magdalene, Saint John being represented as Saint Mary Magdalene, I mean, that's not a problem, because Leonardo always represented Saint John as a young man with long hair, looking very much like a woman. In fact, I think this is interesting, the last work he did, which is at the Louvre, just next to the Mona Lisa, is a portrait of a woman with a very dark background.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was a student at the time, it was marked as a portrait of a woman. When they cleaned it, a cross came out.
Mm-hmm.
So now if you go to the Louvre, it's Saint John the Baptist. Right? So I think that solves the whole problem.
Fascinating.
Okay?
Father, let's go back to, we talked about Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, and that wonderful quote. Let's go back to the year of the Great Jubilee and the years leading up to the Great Jubilee, and Pope John Paul II's letter to artists.
That's right.
I know you're familiar with that letter.
Right.
It's a very beautiful message.
Right.
It was not a time-limited message. It's a message that continues to speak. What struck you about that message?
Well, I hand a copy. I have a copy with me here, and I give a copy to all the students.
Beautiful.
Okay?
Beautiful.
It's good because it's not the usual thing. I mean, it's not just the Pope saying the right thing, you know. You feel that he really personally knows what he's talking about. I mean, he's a good musician, and I've been fascinated by everything he says about art, because, as I said, it's not just the formal statement that a man in authority makes, but somebody who's really knows what he's talking about. What I'm against, what I think does a lot of harm to the church and to culture, is when you have all the kitsch that we have in our churches. I normally start my lectures on Christian art by showing a very, very popular Madonna and Child, which you see in all the shops. Actually, it wasn't even painted as a Madonna. It was painted as a mother and child. And then somebody thought that by putting a circle around its head, it would sell more.
Yeah.
And it became very, very popular. Because sometimes, even if it's not profoundly, Maritain makes the distinction between ecclesiastical and sacred art. So even the church, the stuff that we have in our churches, even if it's not that good, but for certain people, quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur. You get out of it as much as you put into it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't call it great sacred art.
Right.
But if you go towards it with a certain devotion, obviously it works.
Oftentimes we get the question, how can I have that art help me to pray? I can tell you personally, when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, a young priest, I was in Munich and outside of Munich, and I went very often to the Alte Pinakothek
One of
on
the
the
best.
Saturdays, and I would go to the religious wing and sit there on a bench and just sit before a painting. I just said, wow. I mean, nowadays they say this is awesome. These huge paintings of the Bible scenes.
Yeah.
I later realized most of them are from Luke's Gospel. But
Yeah.
how tell our viewers, how could art help us to pray and bring us to Christ?
Well, if you go to the Alte Pinakothek, you'd be impressed by the Dürer. Even if, when he's not sacred,
Yeah.
he can be really powerful. The Four Apostles by Dürer,
Uh-huh.
obviously inspired by the Four Apostles by Bellini
Mhm.
in Venice. And then there's a good example of bad religious art, where you see Rubens,
Yeah.
okay, who was a very good Catholic, went to Mass every day and so on. But I remember a painting at the Alte Pinakothek of a Last Judgment with these very huge women going down into hell, and it's absolutely...
I know it.
You know it. I
Yes,
mean,
yeah.
you can't, and that's the sort of, I mean, and that is produced by a religious man, but the message is not religious at all. I mean, Rubens did a lot of these. We have lovely tapestries in Malta, but they were all produced at the time of the Baroque. Even the titles, it's the what is it? The glorification of the church. It's the of the Eucharist. It's all this triumphalism of the Council of Trent. All right, that's the sort of art which doesn't go at all with the people nowadays.
Mhm.
Okay, it's
What art goes with the people today? What do you
well,
think?
something very, very simple,
Yeah.
something very clear. I don't know. My favorite artist, one of my favorite modern artists, would be Georges Rouault,
Uh-huh.
the Miserere.
Uh-huh.
Certain artists like Fra Angelico would go anytime.
Mhm.
I mean, Byzantine art, Byzantine Christ. Yeah, I saw Piero della Francesca here.
It's one of my favorites.
He's a great artist. He's a great religious artist.
Borgo San Sepolcro.
I think he produced the only decent resurrection.
And it's the one we use as our motto for
That
this
is
network.
not theatrical,
Yeah.
but it's solid,
It's
with
clear.
the face of a Pantocrator.
Yeah.
Beautiful geometry,
Uh-huh.
the vertical and the horizontal.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's that. Piero della Francesca would go very, very well with modern man. Eh?
When the cardinals gather in the conclave, they don't meet in the synod hall, they don't meet in some kind of a conference room or in the audience hall, nor do they meet inside St. Peter's Basilica, but they meet in the Sistine Chapel. The doors are closed extra omnes, and there they are, face to face with this huge reality of choosing the successor of Peter. But they're staring at the wall of the Last Judgment, and they have the ceiling hovering above them. What's the significance of the Last Judgment in the moment of election of the Pope?
I had the experience, terrifying experience, of lecturing in the Sistine Chapel after closing hours. We had some few guests, and I had to say something, and you feel really tiny, because
Right.
the Sistine Chapel is so incredible.
Yeah.
Well, the Sistine Chapel is a treasure house. Architecturally, it's nothing. It's just a big box. But it signifies so much in the history of art. First of all, because that's when the center of art shifted from Florence to Rome, when the Pope called Botticelli, Cosimo, and so on to do that frieze with the life of Christ and the life of Moses all around the Sistine Chapel.
Right.
And then the vault of the Sistine Chapel is the best example of high Renaissance art, where everything is so perfect, everything is so balanced. Michelangelo was supposed to paint 12 huge apostles. Instead, he planned the whole creation, creation of the universe, creation of man, beginning of sin, prophets, sibyls, okay, the 4 episodes, in the span representing 4 episodes in the history of Israel. Okay, so that was perfection. That was perfection, the human figure. The creation of Adam is the perfection of neoclassic, the return of classic art, all right, the head of Adam. It's pure perfection. With Michelangelo as the perfect Platonist. No? 20 years later, the conditions had changed. The church was no longer powerful. The church had been through the worst experience in her history, the sack of Rome in 1528, and the last judgment was supposed to represent this tragedy. Okay, in fact, there was an idea of painting the fall of the angels as well. Okay, and that is another period. It's not High Renaissance, that is Manierist. That's Manierist. So there's no proportion, there's no composition, there's this sort of mixture of Dante Alighieri, there's Acaronte, there's everything. All right? And the idea is to frighten people. It's not a kind Christ, it's the Christ condemning everyone. And what is so interesting is that at that time, that was something that Michelangelo himself was feeling. He himself passed through a spiritual crisis. He wrote some lovely sonnets. And there's a sonnet which I've copied on my breviary, written at this time, when he says, I've been wasting my time. The only thing is to turn to him who on the cross opened his arms. Colui che sulla croce aprì le braccia. The only meaning of life, he says, that's Michelangelo, after he had spent all these years doing all that wonderful work, carving, and so on. He said, look, the only thing is to turn our gaze to him who opened his arms for us on the cross. Che sulla croce aprì le braccia. So I think that really links the artist, the agony and the ecstasy of Michelangelo, who was probably the greatest artist in a very, very true sense.
Father Zerafa, I think you invited all of us to go to a museum, to sit patiently and quietly and absorb the beauty. You yourself are an icon. You invite people into a great story, and you help us to appreciate what Cardinal Ratzinger said so powerfully. The only 2 things that matter are art and then the saints. Yes. Thank you so much for coming. And when I come back to Malta, I'm coming to ring your doorbell.
I promise you a VIP tour, okay?
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.